Let me welcome everyone. As you know, if you're in the future of democracy, free trade, and alliances in the Trump era, you're at the right event. Otherwise, you're going to have to change your room. It is so good to have everybody here. This is an event that is sponsored by the Crossley Center for Public Opinion Research, for the DU Office of Global Engagement, and for the Center for China and U.S. Cooperation. So this is one of these joint and cooperative co-sponsorship events that we're having. And let me introduce our dean, Dean Fritz Mayer, who will do our welcome.
Over there or here?
I think you can do it there, I guess.
I'll just sit here then. Welcome, everyone. It's lovely to see you. A beautiful day. It is, I suppose, a sign of the times that on a beautiful day like this, so many people want to talk about such serious matters as the future of democracy, trade, and alliances. We don't have much territory to cover today, so we will try our best. We have a fabulous panel here, and for a conversation on these topics. Some of you were here Friday evening. We had a conversation about the state of democracy with Anders Rasmussen and Mitt Romney, which was terrific. This gives us a chance to explore some of the same themes, I think, with some of our own colleagues here at DU, as well as a couple of experts from outside. And Floyd, I don't know if you want to introduce our panel.
Yeah, I'll introduce them.
Do that, but let me just say thank you all for being here. Apparently the polls close in a few minutes in North Carolina anyway, so if any of you happen to be looking at your cell phones along the way, we'll know why. Anything major, just raise your hand and let us know what's happening to keep us from checking our phones. But delighted that you're here. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Dean. He is from North Carolina, and that's the primary reason why he's here tonight, is that he wants to be able to report the election results for you directly. There's a lot of staff and a lot of help goes into putting this on, and I want to thank all of them for their tremendous effort, and also the Japanese consulate and here in Denver, and in particular the Consul General Midori Takeuchi, who has been really a big backer of this program. As you know, this is a great night. The dean referenced the fact that this is probably our first election night this year. We will have several more. You know, we love elections. We'll have one in June, the primary, and then, of course, we will have the general in November. Welcome as we sort of launch this, along with the dean, and who I mentioned. His background is public policy, and he's from North Carolina, from Duke. So we have the advantage of that once we start our discussion. I will do a little PowerPoint just on the election, because I know everybody is, one of our themes is the Trump era, and at least partially our conversation will be, will there be a Trump era continuing, and sort of the status of what it is now on some of these themes. We have Ambassador Chris Hill here, who I think just about everybody knows, an ambassador in 3 nations, and almost all of some of the most interesting and major activities that took place over his career. He is the director of the Office of Global Engagement here, and a former dean. We have Koji Murata, who the dean referred to. He's from Kyoto, Japan, Doshisha University. Thank you, sir. He always keeps an eye on my not so good pronunciations. Kyoto's a beautiful city for those of you who have been there, but I had a hard time believing that there was this huge university, 28,000 students. He is a author of a brand new book, a relatively new book, I think, on Ronald Reagan. He's a professor and of understanding American foreign policy and the alliance, international security issues. He's also on a board with a couple of other colleagues for the Defense Ministry, and so he's very up on defense strategy, and he serves on their version of sort of the NPR, a national board for their public television, radio, and internet. Dina Smeltz is in from Chicago. I think it's warmer here. I don't know. It's sort of close,
Much
you know,
warmer
Chicago.
here
But she is the senior research for the Council of Global Affairs, the Chicago Council of Global Affairs. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it is one of the best think tanks in the country. And she is in charge of much of the polling and has this multi-year repertoire of polls she can refer to, and lots of them are about politics, but a lot of them are about the issues that we're going to be discussing, and that's alliances and democracy and free trade. And finally, this is a big panel, but it's a big topic, as the dean referenced, Sam Zhao, who is our director of the China Center, professor, and also, I think very importantly, the editor of one of the best journals on China in the world, the Journal of Contemporary China, which I think we are all very, very proud of. To start, the dean referenced our good friend who came here the other night and got an incredible story in the Denver Post. There's the line from it. Senator Romney received standing ovation for his vote. Did some people see that in the Denver Post? Because it made national coverage. And along with, obviously, a little bit of discussion about, well, actually, there wasn't really any discussion that I recall about impeachment, but the main topic was democracy. He talked a lot about alliances. He talked some about free trade, and he made it quite clear his differences with the administration on foreign policy. And I think that some of those differences reflect the fact that he represents kind of the sort of the establishment, long-time foreign policy consensus. He mentioned Harry Truman more than he did any other president, I recall. He must have mentioned him about 3 times. Thinking about that was that critical moment in which a lot of American foreign policy got established. So he will be a bit of a reference point, I think, tonight. And you'll notice my quick questions there. The dean's going to handle the questioning, but I've got democracy. Is it in retreat? What can we do about it? Tariffs are all now becoming common. Are we winning or losing in that? Alliances and treaties are either disdained, breaking up, or being abandoned. Are we more secure about that or less? And then finally, that reference I made is that there are a lot of foreign observers, and Ambassador Hill and I talk about this time, that are kind of starting to calculate that, well, he could be around another 4 years, and what does that mean? And to some extent, that's sort of one of our themes tonight. But before we start that last line referred to the politics. And this is a dynamic moment tonight to talk about politics, you agree? And I always start with the stock market, which I have to have a bigger slide because it keeps going up and down and up and down. It was down, 700 today. It's hard to keep track. It was at a 29,000 record, the Dow, on the February 15th. And I'd say today it's probably about, maybe 25.5 or so, somewhere in there. But it has been one of the most important things in talking about presidential politics is what's the state of the economy. And it is, frankly, you could argue that there's problems with it, but it's good in general, and the public seems to think it's good. And you will notice that little box over there. The president doesn't fully benefit from the status of that economy. He is given a 56% approval rating on the economy, but he personally has a 46. And that 10-point difference is essentially his behavior, his tone, the problems that he struggles with to some extent, or as Mr. Romney said, his tweeting. which is sort of what you hear in the Republican cloakroom. And that is to say, doing things that drives some people away from him. And that's why this is probably, and we'll talk about that in a second here, a close race. I laid out 4 things that could happen. We could, in November, the status quo, that is to say, the Senate, on all of these, you'll notice the House stays Democratic. There has been some recent talk that possibly Mr. Sanders could endanger the House. I'm not sure that's true, but in any event, I leave the House as Democratic in all of these scenarios. You'll notice that in the status quo, that means the Senate stays Republican. In gridlock, the Senate stays Republican, but there's a Democratic president. You can imagine the difficulty it'll be for that president to get things done, but I think probably Democrats would take it. A Democratic Senate, so Trump survives and the Senate goes Democratic. Very few observers think that because they think to some extent the vote for the president will affect the Senate, particularly in those swing states where it's in play. So that seems unlikely. You'll notice there's no Republican sweep on here because I don't think the Republicans are going to take the House, or I certainly didn't when I designed this about a month and a half ago. There is a Democratic sweep possibility. It is possible the Democrats get a head of steam up, and if they take the presidency, they could take the Senate. So where are things right now? This is what's sort of interesting. Mr. Sanders has 60 delegates, and as I was talking this through with the ambassador earlier today, he said, yes, but Ciruli, you'll notice that Biden has more votes, and he did. He does, because he carried the biggest state, South Carolina, with about a 250,000 vote edge there. And so at the moment, but tonight we'll settle that, and obviously California and Texas and North Carolina and some of these big states will really add a lot to those numbers. The Democrats can't say that they didn't have a lot of people running. You see that list there? That's the list of people running. You probably can barely remember some of those names. When I saw O'Rourke yesterday endorse Mr. Biden, I said, oh, I remember him. Beto! He's back for a second here, so he's back. There are the current polling numbers with Sanders up about 6 points over Biden. And that's narrowed because of this Biden bounce that's going on out there. That was about 10, 12 points about 5 days ago, so the race is tightened. And you'll notice that Buttigieg and Klobuchar and Steyer, I left them in, and that was there. They were at about 11. Now they're at 9. Again, I was talking to the ambassador, and he pointed out, so really they're really going down. They're about 5 now. And that's because they're keeping their names on these polls that were out the last 4 or 5 days. And so people are now, not listing them if you're at the end of that poll in the last couple of days. And there is the obviously the delegates right now. This sort of shows how incredibly quickly this thing moves, because we're, needless to say, in that 1,357, about a third of all the delegates that are being voted on right now. That's that list there of March 3rd. So that's about a third, and it's extremely important. And we will, by tomorrow, we'll have a sort of a sense of, do we have 2 candidates, 3 candidates, 4 candidates? Do they represent who's strong with in the western states and the Northeast? Who's strong in the South? Is there a battleground in the Midwest forming? But look how quickly it then moves into Idaho, Michigan, Washington, Missouri. And then I point out that by the 17th of March, now you're double the number we are right now. By late tonight, we'll be at a little above 30%. We'll be at 60%. So you can see how quickly this moves along. So these candidates won't get any rest on Wednesday. They may take a breath and do a victory lap or be explaining what happened if it doesn't work out perfectly. But they are going to be moving very, very quickly as this proceeds. This was a map designed by Larry Sabato. This is the map from November. And notice those numbers up there. They say November 9th, which is when he first put this map together. And then I have a / Sanders. In other words, he believes that it's right now, Bernie possibly being the nominee, dead even, 248 to 248 with a toss-up of 42 states. And as you can see on the map, because I'm using the old map, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania are his ratings of toss-up states right now. And you could move that around a little bit. You could say, well, I think Michigan's still a toss-up state, or the Republicans tend to say, I think Minnesota's a toss-up state. Indeed, this is just one good shot at it. But his point is, notice, well, under Sanders, it goes to, the Republicans go to 260, and there's only 30 electoral votes in play. And his thinking is that makes Wisconsin and Pennsylvania lean Republican. In other words, move out of just in play and toss-ups and lean over. And so consequently, and then he brings up a couple of others. The point is that who the Democrats nominate will probably make a difference, because all the polls that are done, or many of the polls that are done, and these type of estimates are still being used, they're still doing the generic, and the generic is quite different than once we get a name in there. And of course, the battle for the nomination sort of roughs up the candidates. Notice out here, Arizona was only won by Trump by 2 points. Arizona's going to be a battleground. Arizona has a important Senate seat. Notice Colorado, 5 points. We tend to think out here that that's probably pretty lean Democratic. But I think the president probably thinks it's maybe in play. He was just out. Notice Nevada, how close, and he talks about New Mexico. I'm not sure, but he talks about it. Almost to the end here, but here's the Senate. Because as you know, for example, on about February 15th or so, the Senate passed a resolution on war powers, trying to limit, this was in reaction to Iran, and trying to limit and claw back a little bit of their power. Granted, it was only a resolution. But the point is, the Senate is an important body. And as I pointed out to you, it is truly in play. About 4 seats, possibly switching. Ms. Collins, for example, being one of them that's in play. Mr. Tillis in North Carolina being another one in play. Well, this is, there's Corey, and as you can see the stripes there, that is probably, by most people, is considered the closest seat in the country. Sabato just moved it to lean Democratic. He's been taking a recent look at it in polls and this and that. He said, I think that it's probably lean Democratic. That is to say, it's going to help whoever the Democratic nominee is. But he then had a caveat, and he said it depends to some extent on the Democratic nominee for president, because that will clearly, if that nominee runs below Hillary Clinton in this state for the presidency, she won by 5 points. If that individual only wins by, if he wins, or she, by 1 point or 2 point, or even potentially lose by 1 or 2 points, that could make a difference in this race, because there is such a close correspondence between how people vote for president and how they vote for the Senate. Notice my little quote there. I was recently kind of famous for a brief moment in which I said that I made an allusion to George McGovern because in my sense, the image, it may not be accurate, and you may want to comment on it when we start talking. But my sense is that the image of Bernie, particularly after Bernie Sanders, after the president and the Republicans go to work on him, is going to be similar to McGovern's in 1972. And we can talk about that. If so, that just means all of what Sabato says, and that is it could make a difference on how the election goes. There was that initial slide, and I will not go over that again because we're going to turn this over to our moderator. And finally, there is our panel. So with that, Fritz, we're off.
Well, thank you, Floyd. And just by way of a segue, because we are going to shift a little bit of the focus to talk about democracy, free trade, and alliances, a bit more international. But the obvious point is that elections have consequences. And consequences, obviously, for American foreign policy. So we'll want to come back to that, I think, at the end. And as I said, check your cell phones. I think Ambassador Hill was just telling me, what was the news from?
Well, the news is Bernie won Vermont and Biden won Virginia.
All right, so that's
an exchange he takes.
yeah,
Any
yeah,
day of the
yeah,
week.
yeah.
So he's moved ahead in the delegate
Yeah,
race.
he is now Floyd's slides are now obsolete as a few minutes ago. But the big topics tonight: trade, democracy, trade, and our alliances. In a sense, they're really the great topics that characterize, or the great factors that characterize what is sometimes called the liberal order or the Anglo-American order. These are the central tenets, really, of the international system that the U.S. was so instrumental in putting in place in the aftermath of World War II, and has been the steward, by and large, ever since, promoting democracy, freedom around the world, free trade, and in conjunction with allies around the world. And so, in a sense, as I said earlier, it's a continuation of conversations we've been having here about the state of that whole order. Now, it's widely observed that the trends are not good. Freedom House says that freedom has declined every year now for 14 consecutive years around the world. We see autocrats in many of the largest countries in the world. We see some concerns we could talk about here in the state of our own democracy. Now, there's too big a question. Floyd had a big question, which is what can we do about it? And we have a big panel, and it's a big question. But let me frame it this way. We'll ask each of the panelists to comment on if you could do one thing to try to stem the tide and turn the corner, turn back the clock so that we arrest this deterioration of democracy and really begin to restore the health of politics around the world, either at home or abroad. I'll give you one, if you could do one thing, what would it be? And I should note that when we had this conversation the other night, the focus was really on leadership. And the answer that I think both Senator Romney and former Prime Minister Rasmussen gave was we need great leaders, and that's fair enough. And I guess you can answer it that way if you'd like. But I'm curious if there are other things that come to mind that could be done that really would make a bit of a difference. And I'll tell you what. I'm going to start with Ambassador Hill, and we'll start from the U.S. and then work outwards to our international colleagues here.
Well, thanks for calling me ambassador, but I'm really a professor, which means I'm going to have a very long-winded answer to this. And, that is, I think it's important for people to understand that this problem, this issue of commitment to democracy, didn't just start with Donald Trump. To some extent, he's the result of some trends in the U.S. And, without trying to pick this up in 1066 or something, I would like to say that after the Cold War, there was some sense among Americans that we had a right to do what they call in the NFL end zone dancing. And this idea that we were in this sort of triumphalist mode, and we could essentially tell other countries that their best path forward as democracies is to be just like us. And I think a few things happened along the way. Obviously, in the Trump era, people looked at our model and said, we're not so sure that's for us. So that's one problem. But I think even before that, people don't like doing things that they're told to do. It sort of starts when you're 4 years old, and it sort of intensifies when you're a teenager, but it actually never goes away. And so when I was in places like Albania, getting out of these dictatorships out of the cold, or Macedonia, another country that was in a funk. I mean, Poland, to name another country. You'd think people would listen, and they did listen. But on the other hand, they wanted to say, let us figure this out. And so for Americans to go to these countries in a sort of nanny brigade mode, wagging our fingers at everyone, a sort of secular religion of democracy. I mean, we did this in the 1830s, but I think it was a British philosopher who said, once you stop believing in God, you start believing in things much worse. And so we came back after the Cold War, just kind of ordering everyone around, telling them what to do. And frankly, I think the decline of democracy was already starting. Erdogan has been around before Trump was elected. So all this is to say that I do believe, I'll put my views on my sleeve here, I do believe we need a change here. But I think we need to get back to a decent respect for each other, for, what a Macedonian of all things, a Macedonian prime minister said to me, the way you judge the quality of a democracy is not by the government. You can always cobble together a decent sounding government. It's by the opposition. So we need to have a decent respect for each other, listen to each other, respect our institutions, and stop haranguing everybody, and let our example, and I have no doubt that we are the greatest example in the world. I yield to no one in that, but we've got to get back to that fine example. And I think when we do that, so when we get back to the example that our founders laid out, so I'm being very traditionalist here, let's go back to the ideas with a decent respect for the opinions of others, we're going to be fine, and democracy is going to be fine.
So,
that wasn't too bad.
We're done. That's great. Dina Smeltz, the council has been monitoring and doing polling, evaluating public opinion around the world. You've been tracking some of these trends. Do you agree this started earlier? And your thoughts on where it's both, where do we intervene in this in your view?
Sure. Well, I agree, and I'm going to riff off of the ambassador's comments too, that I've been reading this book by Jill Lepore called These Truths, and it's the history of the United States in one pretty concise volume.
Is your mic on?
Your mic is on, but you got to get it, I think, close to the ears.
No? Yeah.
They're working
Can
out.
you hear me now?
Yeah.
Should I just do this?
Or maybe just hold it. I mean, yeah.
Okay, so I have been reading this great book called These Truths by Jill Lepore. She writes a lot for The New Yorker. She's a professor at Harvard. And the book is a really great read, and it's very concise history of the United States. Anyway, she hits on a point talking about how people used to read newspapers and how the newspapers used to have op-eds from both sides of the political spectrum, one next to the other, like point, counterpoint. And since the advent of the internet, our news consumption is much more curated. It's much more curated now.
Yeah.
And that also, the way we get our news through Facebook feeds, Twitter, or just talking in circles and to the same types of people that think the same way we do. So I think that to amplify what Ambassador Hill just said is that leads to not only not respecting the other person's point of view, but it also leads to not even understanding the point of view or even reaching a point to start to compromise. So I would say, I don't know, I don't have the fix. I'm just diagnosing.
All right, thank you. Well, you both pointed to the, in a way, to inward, Dina, to some of the pathologies here and the causes as well. Chris, in terms of your solution at least, was to kind of get our act together and continue to be an example to the world. Let me turn to Professor Murata and ask the premise here being the role of the U.S., the importance of the U.S. example, I suppose, in world affairs. Let me ask you to comment on whether you agree with that, whether that's a key element of what we're seeing around the world, and your thoughts about what is the most important thing we can do to arrest this trend?
You mean American commitment to the world?
Democracy.
Yeah, to democracy, yes.
I'm not an American citizen, so I have no particular comment on American democracy, but
We
democracy.
have a comment on
Okay,
yours.
yeah.
Go ahead.
The question is really about whether that's important for the rest of the world. But
democracy.
certainly feel free to comment on yours.
Democracy in general, the one thing to fix the democracy is, I guess, education, importance of the education. And, our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation, how they experienced politics, economy, and other things. We have to learn a lot from history. And as you know, Winston Churchill once said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. So we have to learn how dictatorship emerged from history and how many people sacrificed and these kind of things. Education is very important, and this country has a wonderful educational system, but extremely expensive. That is the problem.
Yeah, we hear that from our students from time to time.
But I think that, can I just
Please,
interrupt
yes.
1 second, a two-finger here.
Yeah.
I think also that goes hand in hand with misinformation and which I think is a really big problem these days. And that other countries are feeding disinformation into this country and even interfering with our elections. So I think education is one of the keys to try to combat some of the false information. And I think we're failing to some extent to train people how to analyze what's a real source versus fake news.
No, certainly an issue that we think about a lot in terms of how do we arm our students, as it were, to be thoughtful consumers, or I suppose arm all of ourselves, because we're all somehow subjected to the manipulation. Most of the time, we're completely unaware of the extent to which we're manipulated. I want to get Professor Zhao in here as well, as a scholar of China and Asia and observer of many things in the world. Your perspective on this question?
Here, I think when you talk about solutions, you have to find the causes for the declining of democracy. I think several causes here are very important. One is the liberal democracies are now become less liberal. And a lot of liberal democracies are very weak and also dysfunctional, especially now in the United States. A lot of this survey data have already proved that the quality of the liberal democracies has been declining. Some people even argue that there is a recession of liberal democracy. So how to resolve the problem of the less liberal of liberal democracy? How could those established democratic countries to become more functional and to set good examples for other countries? That's one very, very big problem and causes for the declining of the democracies. Second, I think here is important that is the democracy has not really produced what many people expected. In fact, why the authoritarian governments now have been advancing, like China, Russia, and Brazil got problems. Iran now is a target, and the Philippines now is a breaking democracy, and many other countries. Why? Because they have become disillusioned about liberal democracy. They did not produce, especially from economic perspective. A lot of authoritarian government, like China, I didn't mention that I studied China. The China model is a so-called authoritarian state, making use of the free economic market. In fact, to make the economy second largest in the world within 30 years. Why those African countries, Latin American countries, they admire China because 30 years ago, China 30 years ago was as poor as those the poorest countries in the world. 30 years after, China became second largest economy, and those countries were still as poor as they used to be 30 years ago. So the China model in that case using authoritarian, a strong state to develop economy become somehow admired by those countries. So the authoritarian government produced those products of democratic countries in many democratic, especially those emerging democracies, have not been doing really well. And the US using forces like in Iraq, where Ambassador Hill was the ambassador there, and Afghanistan and some other countries to promote democracy has been really generated opposite results, anti-Americanism, even anti-democracy. I have a friend, Larry Diamond. We have been 30 years friend. In fact, when US conquered Iraq, he was in Denver. I had a conference in Vail, and he was called by Condi Rice to go to as an advisor to the US occupation authorities to give a design democracy in Iraq. Then he talked to me, said, should I go? I'm a Democrat. And this Republican government, should I go? I said, you should go. I said, American citizen, you should have just answered the call from your own country. He went there, 3 months he came back, said, I will not go anymore. He wrote a book, very famous book, I don't know how many people read, Squandered Victory. Basically said, I cannot design democracy here. People's basic living requirements, the safety, economic, the bread on the table, nothing you have provided. Why you talk about democracy? And in fact, because he did not want to go back, he bought his own flight ticket and also the bullet, the State Department, his office, not your office, your department did not reimburse him. He had to pay from his own research grant. And so that's the issue. And many other issues, I don't want to take too much time here. Economic inequality is a very big problem. Those kind of illiberal, populist movement in the world and have been emerging. All those kind of problems have been the causes for the declining of democracy.
Yeah. Well, this is great. So let's pick up on this theme, the connection between economic performance, both in terms of growth and I suppose in terms of inequality. I'll ask each of you to comment as well on this theme. Is that, in fact, one of the big drivers in the world? And I guess the other question really is one around, I mean, the China model, for shorthand anyway, is very appealing out in the world right now. And there are many who are, in fact, questioning whether democracies can produce the kind of economic gains that we've seen in China and perhaps elsewhere. So comment on whether you agree that this is part of the driver and whether you agree with that premise that democracies are somehow unable to produce the kind of benefits, the economic benefits that we see.
I think it is, Dean, because the thing you see almost universally, particularly in these advanced democracies, is a concern about immigration. And immigration is being caused to a large extent by inadequate economies in North Africa, Central Africa, Central America, Latin America, Caribbean countries, and people are on the move. For some places, it's violence, like Syrian war, but in many places, it's a look for a desire to get to find opportunity. And the countries, the Germanys and the Frances and the Great Britons that are getting immigrants, they're getting a reaction from their working class. And same here to some extent. It's also being manipulated to some extent by demagogues, but nonetheless, they're getting a reaction from the working class that's saying, these people are going to take our jobs. We simply don't have enough jobs. And so to some extent, it's almost like climate change. It's a worldwide phenomena, this inequality and this economic deprivation in many places, and it's causing many people to move, and that movement is also causing the huge stress we see in a lot of advanced democracies.
Yeah, yes.
At the same time,
yes.
I think that is a storyline that gets played a lot by media and certain political players, but at the same time, immigration is going to be the saving grace for the United States now and for a lot of the graying countries in the world that won't have the labor force to support the aging populations there. But I think that it is, easier to achieve the American dream in Western Europe today than it is in the United States, to be honest, because the social safety nets in Europe are stronger, and the inequality gap in the United States is ridiculously huge.
That's true, yeah. Ambassador Hill.
I'm going to stick with my theme of American busybodyism. And, and by that I mean, I think it is one thing to expect country X to live up to some human rights standards. They are enshrined in the United Nations. I mean, frankly, they're enshrined in religions, for that matter. And I think asking countries to live up to some standards, you don't beat political prisoners. You don't have political prisoners. There's certain human rights standards. And I think we, as a country, we've kind of conflated this whole issue of democracy with human rights. That is, we're not only telling you to live up to human rights standards, but we're also telling you how to do it, what system to use to do it. Now, a few weeks ago, Julie and I were up in Iowa, and I foolishly asked someone, so how do these caucuses work? Unbelievable, just unbelievable. I mean, and I was joking to people, I could imagine going to Albania and saying, no, you don't want elections, you want caucuses. And, frankly, it had nothing to do with what we would consider proper democracy. But it's another thing to espouse human rights. And so on this issue of I'm getting to your question,
okay.
On the issue of economics, I think to some extent you need to kind of step back and understand the culture. For example, in Korea, you had a pretty tough guy, President Park, and you could say he asked Chung Se-young and a bunch of cronies to form the basic elements of Korean industry. By the way, they're pretty good at it. Chung Se-young built something called Hyundai. Kim Woo-jung built something called Daewoo. I mean, these were, Lee Byung-chul built something called Samsung. A model, you could dismiss it as crony capitalism, but my goodness, I mean, Korea, it worked. Now, let's go down to Marcos in the Philippines. Same thing. He appointed various buddies, and of course, nothing worked. So I think, too, it's a little difficult to go to those two countries and sort of tell them how to do this. The Koreans did something that we may not have chosen, but frankly, they did it well. And the Philippines did the same thing, and they did it poorly. In both cases, however, I think it was important for us to lay out certain standards of behavior to our fellow human being. And I think when you do that, you're on much safer ground. And then you can start measuring, is it a democracy that is going in the right direction? Is it a democracy going in the wrong direction? Rather than tell them precisely, what speed to get there and how to do it, and you really ought to use caucuses here. No, I mean, that's up to them. But we need to have a respect for their cultural antecedents, for how they operate, and we need to develop this fundamental, first of all, understanding about the world, but secondly, respect, and not always denounce people who are different than we are.
Even democracies are different, I think.
Yeah.
American democracies are different from Japanese democracy. Yeah. And Japanese democracy is different from European democracy. So each country, each society has their own history, their own culture, and their own different political environment. So you don't want to have a universal type of democracies to fit to every country, every world. So really, I think Ambassador Hill's point is very important. You have to respect different countries, different national situation, and a different culture, different society, history. That's very important.
But I sort of think that there is still at least some principles, and I'm thinking of Poland right now, which you know a lot about, Chris, about an independent press, an independent judiciary, respect for judges and not harassing them either online or in person. of which they're getting into trouble and a lot of criticism from the EU. I mean, wouldn't you say, though, that there's still, like you say, there's this basic model or form, but if you're violating it, you're clearly becoming authoritarian, et cetera.
Insofar as you come up with a system where different institutions don't respect each other's authorities, you are going to infringe on human rights. It's going to go in the wrong direction. And by the way, I'm sorry to report, some of that's happening in this country.
Yeah.
You know, we're seeing human rights infringed on because of our failure to respect different institutions.
Professor Murata.
Yeah. The relationship between economy and politics are quite complicated, I guess. You know, when China joined WTO 2003, many people expected now China is getting into multilateral trade system, and once China is getting richer and richer, China will be democratized. Many people expected, and our experience is the GDP per capita surpasses $10,000, then democracy begins. In case of South Korea, in case of Taiwan and others, but China is not in this case. And when China joined the WTO, you know, many people expected China would become another United States, right? Democratized, richer country. But now, you know, many people, according to The Economist, British weekly magazine, according to The Economist, now many people are rather worried. The United States, this country might become another China.
Well, on that note,
let me
two fingers here, and then we're going to segue to talk about trade. So.
In fact, for many Chinese, they thought Americans are such idealistic people. They try to impose their own lifestyle to China. And they always thought their lifestyle, their political system is the best. So they expect China to follow the same path. But the Chinese, they have their own authority. For me, very often, I think I talk to Chinese, they always ask the question, why you worship democracy like we worship communism? These are similarly something utopian.
No.
You cannot accomplish that point. So for many people in China, that 1.4 billion people, how we rule that big population as you rule 300 million people in the United States. So China is going to a very different path. So even you talk about $10,000 per capita, now China is on that at that level. The issue democracy is not there. I think the issue is the mid-income trap. If China can continue to develop, that's the issue here.
Yeah, quickly on two fingers on this, and then we're yes.
I think you could argue, though, that actually we brought China into the WTO so that China would play by the rules of multilateralism, not necessarily to change its politics. But just to round out your initial question, there are winners and losers to globalization and trade, which we're going to get into. And yes, they have impacted elections around the world. That's why you see a big urban-rural divide, London, voting differently than the industrials, pieces of the UK to Brexit. You can't ignore the fact that globalization has not benefited
Absolutely.
everybody.
So it's a great segue. So in the trade realm now, looking back at the time of the creation of the WTO in the early 1990s, that period of expansion in the European Union, creation of NAFTA in North America, the WTO, the accession of China, there was a strong sense again of a direction of history in the direction of more and more free trade, multilateral trade agreements. This was the path forward. There was long discontent. There was always discontent with that. There was opposition, but that engine really slowed and died in the early 2000s, certainly with the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. A lot of the energy came out of it. Now people are talking about deglobalization, the possibility that we will retrench back into either national or possibly more closely held regional supply chains. You see increasingly nationalistic rhetoric and the use of tariff measures. Who knows what the aftermath of this coronavirus will be in terms of chilling our enthusiasm for long supply chains. So let me ask the panel where you see this going. Is this a kind of blip in the road? We are so integrated, these supply chains are robust, we will continue, notwithstanding the nationalistic rhetoric and the occasional tariff use, we will continue down this path of increasing or considerable global integration, or do you see the possibility for real retrenchment back to more protectionism, national economies? I don't know who would like to take that.
Let me start.
Sam?
In fact, we talk about globalization. We talk about two types of globalization. And globalization, which the current wave started after the end of Cold War, is by many people called liberal globalization. And in the Western terms, we talk about economic liberalization and political democratization and also privatization, this kind of Western concept of the globalization, which was successful for quite a while until the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, and until a lot of inequalities of the globalization. Some countries losers, some countries are winners, and some countries win more than others. Some people lose more. So that kind of issues eventually come out. So this type of liberal globalization has been challenged by many people from the United States all the way to the authoritarian countries. And China has another different type of globalization. I term that as a state-centric globalization. And it has several things. They talk about political multinationalization. The world multinational is not the US at the center or hegemonic power at the center. There are a lot of power centers. Then in that case, we have a international democratization, not the internal democratization. It's a globally, each country has its own voice and a vote in the global society. Then they talk about pluralization of the culture. We respect each other's cultures, which I think China, they said that, but they have not done well on that. But these two types of globalization has produced very different types of results. I think, which I don't want to say, that the world now is moving to China's state-centric, sovereign-centric globalization, which I don't know is good or bad, but that's what I see today in the world.
The trend. Professor Murata.
You can argue that some country is a winner and some country is a loser of the globalization. But my sense is that the gap between the rich and poor among the countries are getting smaller, right? China is getting richer. South Korea is getting richer. So the gap between rich and poor among the states are getting smaller. But the gap between rich and poor inside the country is getting wider. That is a problem. You know, the gap between the rich country and the poor country is smaller. This changes distribution of power in international politics. And the gap between the rich and the poor inside the country destabilizes democracy. The combination is dangerous.
And even if you look within China, China was once one of the most egalitarian countries on earth, Gini coefficient.
Colonization,
So what you see now is that China is one of the least, is actually more unequal in some way, by some measures than the United States, the gap between rich and poor.
GDP efficient China is as high as the United States.
Yeah, it is.
US and China are the most unequal societies in the world.
So it'll be interesting to come back to this point that you just made, is the internal inequality, is that the destabilizing force? Yes, Ambassador Hill.
I think international global supply chains and globalization is here to stay. I think there was a certain amount of arrogance in how fast it moved. It came at a time also of the sort of anti-regulation, this notion that regulation is not applicable even when you have complete market failure, and we had some market failures. But I mean, if you go back to, the late 1990s when they were having some of these G7 meetings, and lo and behold, there are people who were anti-global, and they're kind of dismissed as being kooks and everything. But frankly, there was a lot of pushback for about 25 years. So it clearly was not kind of put out well. And also, it came at a technological revolution. I mean, obviously it's related. It wasn't like it was a happenstance if the technological revolution came at the time of this globalization. But my goodness, I mean, when you have job loss, 60% of which due to technology, of course people are going to be looking around at China or whoever as the culprit here. So it has absolutely exacerbated the problems of state to state. It also came at a time when you've had this fragmentation of opinion where, we're talking about the internet. I mean, it's just an amazing amount of things that have happened at the same time. So I think when you disaggregate it a little, you're still going to have globalization. And I hope we're a lot smarter for it. And I hope we don't react in the way that our government has reacted, but rather in a longer-term, prudent way to try to move forward.
Let me ask my colleagues who study opinion in this space of where the publics are in the world, and maybe that's what you were going to comment on. How much support is there? I think the polls show continued pretty good support for free trade. That's my understanding, but I'd be curious to hear from you, sort of where are the publics in this country and elsewhere on this question?
Well, in this country in particular, public support for trade is super high, the highest it's been ever in our polling since the early 2000s. And so it's super high. People have different ideas about the best way to go about putting together trade deals. But what I really worry about is what Chris had just touched on, is that in the future, as things automate and people are put out of jobs, many people, how do we deal with that? I think that's, I go to Amazon Go. We have an Amazon Go in our office building now. And all you do is show your phone when you go in, you pull something off for lunch, it just registers in your phone. More and more places, there's not a single person there except one person who comes in to stock it every morning. So I think education was a really big factor in the 2016 election.
Nice.
And as people are displaced and fewer jobs are available, I think we need policies worldwide to deal with that.
You need answers to people losing their jobs.
Yeah.
And that's
Let me respond to Murata's one point. You talk about the internal disparity has been increased, and the disparity among countries has been narrowed. I don't think that's the case. In fact, what is narrowing is between developed countries and developing countries. But the gap within developing countries has been widened. I have a lot of data to show that type of development. So these results in both internally and externally has produced those kind of populist movement. That's kind of anti-elite, as you said, anti-establishment, anti-institutions. All those type of populist movement have been developed both in developing countries and particularly in developed countries. But here, another issue I think we touched upon is that we talk if the globalization will continue. I think it will continue. But the issue here is that it's not linear globalization. Globalization could boast globalization, could also boast de-globalization. In the history, already seen these two directions move. So now the current stage is kind of backlash against globalization. But this backlash, I think eventually would be stopped by what it produced, which I think would be very, very damaging to the world, to many other countries. People will eventually realize, some people, I think Remini made a very good point, that disaster or leader, this could make change disaster, which will produce disaster or other problems, because this kind of backlash or deglobalization would not produce economic growth or prosperity and many problems. And it will not also resolve those kind of trade, for example, trade war, protectionism, will not resolve the problems. President Trump's trade war with China wants to bring manufacturers back to the United States and want to resolve the trade deficit. Neither of them has been accomplished. What it has done is to damage American economy and the Chinese economy. No winners, only losers who lose more than others.
Well, but we could agree with that, and I do agree with that. And as someone who's been working, in an earlier life on helping to advance free trade, I tend to think that way. But countries do sometimes do stupid things, and the question of the backlash is non-trivial. If in fact there are a lot of people who either lose their jobs, or what is more likely that this exacerbates the gap between rich and poor.
Right.
I mean, right now in this country, there are plenty of jobs, actually. I mean, we're doing pretty well on
People
the
aren't
job
matched
front.
to the job.
But most of them are preparing my cappuccino at Starbucks. That's not necessarily the path forward.
right.
So
And I don't think Americans want a rollback of globalization. I think they want an answer to the inequality more. Like even we ask open-ended questions. Why do you support active participation in world affairs for the United States? They'll say, our country is interconnected globally around the world. You can't disentangle. The world is enmeshed today. So I don't think there's
and let me use that as a jumping off to the third theme that we have here, which is alliances. So the publics continue to recognize that we are interconnected, and presumably the logic of that is that we need international alliances, we need cooperation, we need these international institutions. Yet they too, maybe predating fairness, President Trump, but certainly in this moment with the president, they are under some attack, whether it's NATO or the WTO or the UN organizations or the possibility of a TPP, and we could go down the list of those things. Again, this similar question I asked earlier, is this a blip, or that we will come back to recognizing the logic of the need for these kind of international organizations, or is there something afoot here, not just in this country, but elsewhere, this nationalist impulse that is really problematic, is really tearing apart these institutions? Thoughts?
I think the international panoply of institutions, whether it's the WTO or, I think they have a real logic. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, the United States, well, at least some people in the United States regard this as some big international conspiracy to deny our leadership. And the rest of the world sees it as a big American conspiracy to enshrine our leadership. In fact, it does extend our reach. It absolutely is in our interest, but it's in other people's interests too. Strict comparative advantage, economics 101. I think we'll come around to that. As for alliances, it's a different issue, but I think alliances are the best thing that ever happened to us after World War II. And we will get a president in here who's read a book or two and will understand it.
Let me jump in.
Biden just took North Carolina. I just thought I'd pass that on.
Talking about the alliance and the global system. Here, I think
He took Alabama.
post-World War II, a global system has been composed of two parts. One is a UN Charter system. All those multilateral institutions, functional and security on all different areas, that's global. There's another part of the global system, which is the US-centered alliance system. During the Cold War, we had a Soviet Union part that disappeared. So we had a US-dominated alliance system. So this alliance system is something now in question, which served its purposes. Now, I think U.S. has a big problem. In front of my colleagues here, is that U.S. is overreached, overextended.
With alliances?
And with everything globally. U.S. has exhausted itself, especially after the end of Cold War, when you mentioned that Fukuyama mentioned the end of history and the triumph of the democracy and the unipolar movement. U.S., in order to maintain this unipolar movement, maintain this hegemonic democratic world, has paid so much, too much, exhausted itself. That's what we see domestically in the US. We see isolationism. Globally, we see a lot of responses to these kind of problems. So before we strengthen those alliance systems, we have to make clear what is the US role. I mean, someone in your panel that evening, that European said, we want the US to be world police. I don't know if that's in the US interest, to only US to pay for to be a world police. Anybody else should pay together. And not only the Western dominant alliance system, China, some other countries, we should integrate those countries into this system. In that case, this world will be safer, stable, and more peaceful.
All right. So I'm going to ask Professor Murata, because from the perspective of Japan, a big major alliance with the U.S., how do you react to this?
Well, international organizations such as the United Nations, extremely important. Everybody knows that, and multilateral cooperation is necessary. Everybody knows that. Having said so, now we are very much concerned about the coronavirus, right? This event demonstrates one thing is Chinese way of governance is not necessarily so sufficient, right? The China model is not necessarily so sufficient. This is one thing. The second thing, in order to prevent the coronavirus, the United States alone cannot do anything. We need an international cooperation, right? Multilateral cooperation. And now we have many audiences tonight, and people coming here know that. Everybody here knows that how important international cooperation, international organizations such as the United States important. Everybody knows. Problem is people who do not come here. How to tell them? That is the important point.
In public opinion, there is, as Dina pointed out, there is tremendous support for our alliances, and particularly those sort of high profile like NATO. But obviously the president, and he's not alone, has found a constituency that believes that we're being taken advantage of, that these folks are not paying their fair share. And of course, Democrats and Republicans for years have been complaining about that in relationship to NATO. He simply has much more aggressive language and a much more aggressive approach. And obviously, I don't think he particularly cares for an alliance because he's not a multilateralist. But nonetheless, he's found an opinion current out there that is attracted to some of the vulnerabilities of our alliances. I tend to agree with Chris that they are. I'm sort of a Mattis person. You don't you don't live in this fairly dangerous world without friends, and you need to have allies. But I also think that I think we're going to probably benefit in a way once this is passed to take a look at these alliances and say maybe some of these are not as important, as you said, Sam, or that some of these really ought to be made even more important, that they're absolutely critical. I personally would have kept the trade agreement in the Pacific, the TPP. And fortunately, Japan is kind of giving it a shot here of trying to keep it alive. But maybe there are some others that we could either downgrade or not pay as much attention to.
I think to some extent, we put excessive pressure on these alliances. I mean, for example, I wish Germany gave more money to the military. Or maybe I don't.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm kind of okay.
There's a reason why. There is a
remember the
history
Second
there.
World War.
And, Germany took care of some issues in the southern tier in Europe. We were not prepared to bail out the Italian economy or the Spanish. Germany took care of it. And I think this utter nonsense of turning this into some sort of accounting book exercise where Germany was 1.4 or something and needed. Yeah. This is utter ridiculousness. And that goes back to the question in this country, we need to get serious about our political leaders. and not think this is some kind of reality TV show.
Well, let's say
People need to be smart.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's segue back to where we started to the politics, and I think we want to have some time for questions.
In
from
about
the
5
audience.
minutes, we had to switch to the
So
audience.
let's do a quick round robin on the election and its consequences. So at this point, I think it's clear that either President Trump will be reelected, or one of two Democrats, Sanders or Biden. And I think based on the presentation you made, and I think many of our own analyses, the more likely possibilities are probably Trump and Biden at this point. But we can debate that question. Three
Texas
available.
hasn't reported, though.
Yeah, well, as soon as Texas is in, we'll know the answer to that question. So what were the other results, by the way, that we have? North Carolina, what was, somebody said Alabama? And Virginia for Biden.
Yeah, Biden and Bernie took Vermont so far.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I would expect that. So the question, quick round robin, on any of these issues that we've been talking about, what difference does it make? What will be very different if we have a President Sanders or President Biden versus President Trump?
Well, I think on all three of
Floyd.
them, in my opinion, I think that the Trump era will, if it continues, will go in the direction it is currently going. It will, under almost no conditions, will it advocate democracy. It'll never criticize, in my opinion, except under very unusual circumstances, an autocrat who does something undemocratic. I don't think there's going to be any reversal in the use of tariffs and his overall approach to deficits or trade deficits, which I think are prima facie are going to limit foreign exchange trade. And finally, on alliances. Unless we see something different going on out there, I don't think he is going to change there either. As you know, I think Macron just said he sees NATO as essentially a business exchange. We give him a lot of money and or buy his goods or buy American goods, and you give us protection. We're sort of become mercenaries, and he wasn't interested in that.
Well, let's more or less accept the premise. If we have Trump, we're going to see more of the same. What's different if there's Sanders or Biden?
Well, we have already experienced, we have already known who Mr. Trump is, right? From an alliance perspective. And we know something about Mr. Biden as a vice president or a senator. We have no idea President Sanders' policy toward Japan, Asia, or international affairs.
Does anybody know?
Nobody knows. I don't think.
But there was a recent article, Tom Wright in The Atlantic wrote about the centrist and progressive wings of the Democratic Party, and basically saying that the progressives would pull back troops from Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan's already being dropped down. But in general, the platforms of both the centrists and the progressives are based on values, projecting our values, promoting democracy, decrying authoritarianism, promoting allies, and working multilaterally. That it was mostly coming down to budget cuts and defense spending.
So you wouldn't expect dramatic differences in these realms between Sanders and Biden, where they presidents?
It's hard to say because there's not a lot of specifics on the
Sure. This is a
Sanders
setup
side of
for
the
Ambassador
platform.
Hill.
I would agree.
I mean, I think, I spent a lifetime telling people in countries that democracy is not just about elections, it's about respect for institutions, separation of powers. I still believe that very strongly, but I agree this election is an extremely important one in our history. I think to some extent our country has been barreling down the highway with a bad case of road rage. And everybody who somehow looks at us the wrong way, we scream at them, we do whatever. So I think what I'd like to see is a president who calms down a little and calms us all down a little and it is a great country. I mean, I've never been ashamed to represent this country. And, to hear some of our politicians, you think we're the worst country in the world. So I think the first thing is we need someone to calm us down. And then I think we need to respect these institutions and to try to, reset our example for the world. But I see international economic institutions as absolutely critical to get through this thicket of economic issues. I see international security organizations, especially regional security organizations, as being very important. I'd like to see more. We were talking last night at dinner, Koji, I'd like to see what we can do to kind of calm things down between Korea and Japan. I mean, I'm sorry, two countries that play baseball ought to be able to get along. And so I would like to see a calmer world. And I mean, I have my views on which politicians can do that, but I think we all have a responsibility.
So you would vote for the calmest of the
yeah,
of the
I'm all in
candidates.
favor of calm.
I will say.
My biggest concern about American politics is a polarization, which has been in last several decades, all decades so, become increasingly intensified. I came from China 35 years ago. Why I came to the United States? I stay here because I thought this country is very moderate, and people are willing to make a compromise, to make things done, to make things work out. What I have seen last decade also is that nobody wants to get things done, either my way or your way, my way or highway, which has been such a very polarized tendency and lead to dysfunction and also gridlock. That is the problem. Now, on both sides, I'm very concerned. Either two rightists, Trump policy and personality, characters, I'm very concerned. And on the left side, socialism is also a concern. Because both sides will lead to somehow dysfunction of democracy and lead to some, what I see, which I don't know if you agree with, to China. America is more like China and become less liberal, and because more and more authoritarian in the politics realm. So what I want to see is that those politicians or leaders come to the middle way, to the central part, try to unite both sides to get majority of American people working together, which I think I'm very confident. I see my friend here, Brooke Banbury, he told me a very good lesson in Diana's house. We had dinner, you told me, never bet against America. That's what he told me. I learned. I remember that. So we should have hope for the U.S. U.S. will exhaust, that's what Children said, U.S. will exhaust all options, find the right way eventually. I think that's America.
Thank you, Sam. Well, that's a great note to stop our conversation. As you can see, we can go on for a very, very long time. We do have a little bit of time left, and we'd love to field some questions. So please direct your questions to anyone at the panel. Tell us who you are and state your questions. And we have a microphone over here. So it's a very all right. It's a very shy group this evening. We've totally answered the. Here we are, over here, all the way, of course.
One brave person.
Yes, just getting us started.
Hi, my name is Pam, and I wanted to know, there's a lot of discussion regarding the tech industry right now and the impact it's having on all of these things. And what do we do about that? I mean, they're kind of uncontrolled. I don't know to what extent we can or should control them, and I'd be interested in what you have to say.
Are you referring to the impact on media and information, or
media and information and other things too? But yeah.
We'd like to answer that.
I think it screams out for rules of the road. I think we're going to need more international regulations to deal with this problem of I mean, it's a huge problem. Of course, we're talking about a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, if you're thinking about the Facebooks of the world, these platforms that arose that aren't traditional media, they've arisen outside of any regulatory regime. They've been able to say we're just a platform. We're not responsible for the content. There's certainly a lot of discussion in this country, but also in Europe and elsewhere around the world of how we get a handle on that. And as you know, the technology is getting ever smarter in the sense of being able to fool us, the deep fakes, ever smarter in its ability to prey on our weakness, to how much we love to hear what we already believe, those kinds of things. So I think there's a lot of smart people thinking about this now, and there's a lot of interest out there in trying to get a handle on this. But
we're
a long way.
We're only about a decade from having incredible optimism and concerning the potential of online communication and our cell phones. Think of the Arab Spring. Think of the various grassroots revolutions that affected countries, whether it was Iran or in Eastern Europe, even Russia to some extent, how we thought that this was going to be a tremendous liberating power for the public. And obviously it still has that effect. That's one of the things we see here locally for those of us who are involved in local politics, is how quickly a movement, whether people have a complaint about something, it is really a tremendous boon for citizen activism. But it's also turned into, in this last decade, an incredibly destructive thing too, of trolling people, attacking people, also organizing and putting out there racism and fascism, anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you see what's going on now. And then the counter is what Sam kind of refers to, and that is that the greatest authoritarian state right now is obviously China, and they're reaching into that ability to control the online information. They're kind of in a way using it in a positive fashion for the coronavirus, but if you look at it, it has terrible negative implications, and that is knowing something about everybody, being able to categorize people by your social category, what you've bought, how you've behaved, how we have graded you, and we're talking hundreds of millions of people this could go on. So that, as I say, that tremendous optimism we had, of which we still continue to use, I think, but certainly locally, has become a real threat to human freedom, in my opinion. And I guess I agree with Fritz's that we're working on it. I mean, I don't see anything near a resolution. You know, the Democrats right now, probably more than the Republicans, but also the Republicans are talking about how to regulate these the Facebooks and the Twitters, how maybe break them up. It's been really great for lobbyists. There's probably a new 1,000 lobbyists in Washington, D.C. to protect Silicon Valley.
Well, they're the jobs right there. That's
exactly.
good.
Exactly. And I see us moving continually down that direction. But this is maybe one of the greatest crises we face.
Yeah. All right, in the back, and then we'll come up here. Yes, good.
This question is for Professor Murata. What is the status of the Trans-Pacific Partnership? I know the U.S. is not a part of it, but has it actually been implemented? And if so, are there any measurable effects, positive or negative?
You mean TPP, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
They call
CT.
CTPP now.
CTPP.
Yeah.
Is already
It's in-
effective,
Comprehensive,
right?
Yeah, it's effective now.
progress.
Already effective without the United States, unfortunately. So we can wait for you. we can wait for you. Please join us anytime.
Right here.
I'd just like you to comment. I think we expected too much. It took us over 100 years to get a vote for women. It's taken us 300 years to build all of our institutions. And we go to these countries and we say, okay, you be a democracy. You know, they may not have the education, they don't have the experience, they don't have the institutions, and so on and so forth. So when you all are talking about, or we are talking about, a democracy fading around the world, I wonder if we didn't set too high of expectations and these democracies are growing slowly. They started out here because we said they're here, but in fact, they weren't democracies. They're democracies in name only.
You know, we've been watching this pretty carefully now since the Second World War, and Larry Diamond's one of the people that watches them the closest, Freedom House, and they have a long list of criteria of which you could, look at it and say, well, yes, that makes sense. I mean, it might be subject to some criticism that Chris made, and that is that there's a bit too much nannyism or cookie cutting. But when I look down that criticism, I say, well, it's kind of hard to have an exchange between two different political parties without this. It's hard to have informed citizens unless you have a free press. I mean, you sort of look down at, and clearly they have documented basically since about the early 2000s a decline not only in the number of democracies, but in the performance of many democracies that we had up at a higher level. In terms of things that I was talking to Chris about, let's say in some of the Eastern European countries. And you might say, well, they're following their own characteristics, okay, but at some point there has to be, in my view, a sort of a criteria, an objective ability to look at it and say, boy, that really doesn't look like those people have the ability to do what we think would be exercising their democratic rights. And in that sense, I do think there has been a decline. But
I agree. I don't have any problem with a UN list. I don't have any problem with an NGO list. I just have a problem with a U.S. report card about everyone, that they wait for their report card. And, and we give report cards on everything. And I remember we give them on trafficking in persons, which is a terrible thing. It's a U.S. report card. I remember I was representing East Asia, and there I was haggling over, because I was trying to help Malaysia, and I was trying to get Bangladesh downgraded so I'd get Malaysia upgraded. I was trafficking in countries at that point. I don't think a bilateral, a country ought to be doing that with other countries and announcing it like it's their annual. But UN, Freedom House, all these things, absolutely, go at it.
I think that's an interesting observation, and keep in mind it's not as easy to analyze that as you would think. The Philippines, for example, right now is trying to, I think, abrogate our treaty agreement there, our military treaty, and at least partially it's because we are critical of the country. Well, when I say we are, that, believe me, is not the government. It is, or let's put it this way, the administration. It's coming from a lot of NGOs. It's coming from some particular Congress people criticizing the government's treatment of criminals, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, he is so sensitive that he is blaming, to some extent, the administration for all the noise that's out there. But you're right.
I do think the premise of the question is really interesting, whether we're a little too narrowly focused and that we don't have a long enough sense of history in terms of the development of these things.
In a long-term history, I don't know if a democracy will be the only political system in the world, because the world is the beauty is multiple. I mean, the pluralistic. There are all variety of the peoples and systems. So the competition between democracy and the non-democratic countries, I think, will continue. And will continue for quite a while. During the Cold War, the communism and capitalism competed. Capitalism win. Now we see capitalism has been combined with authoritarianism. We produced a new type of non-democratic, but somehow in their standards, successful development model, which now is a big challenge to the liberal democracy. And not only liberal democracy is in the declining, but also it's been challenged by those non-democratic, but somehow capitalistic, or called Leninist capitalism, or state capitalism. You can use all the terms to describe those kind of systems in competition with liberal capitalism, liberal democracy. Which side will win? And I don't know. I hope the liberal democracy will win eventually, but this competition is a long term. Maybe after this competition, we come out some other types of competition between democracy and some other type systems.
We have time for one more
criticizing
Time for
question.
one more
Human
question.
rights
So
and
whoever has the
democracy.
microphone has the.
Good evening. I appreciate your talk tonight. It was very wide-ranging. I just wanted to remind you that Colorado does have caucuses, and it's Saturday at 2:00.
So true.
And that brings me to the question that we get the government we deserve, or the one we vote for anyway. And how can we as citizens take on more responsibility for the kind of government and the kind of policies that are enacted in our name?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think Ambassador Hill at one point described our foreign policy as taking a victory dance in the end zone, and I think there's probably been a sense in which we've all sort of taken our democracy or our government or our political processes, our role as citizens, for granted in this country. And this is a moment where I think all of us who care in this great contest, as you say. And if you look back on U.S. history, the founding fathers, thought of this as a fragile experiment. Lincoln said this was a test of the Civil War, whether this nation or any nation so created, which so conceived could long endure. So this sense of ourselves as an experiment, as somewhat fragile. I think we've seen the fragility of our institutions that we thought maybe were more robust than they were in the last few years. So to your question, I think it's a moment for all of us and citizens to sort of say we have a job to do, and we need to accept that job.
We are making some progress. I would predict more than 1.5 million people will vote in this primary, the all-time record. And we decided to allow unaffiliated voters to participate. And at last I looked, about 500,000 have. So we're having our democratic moment, and that's, I think, probably good news.
That's a good news. That's a good news to end on. Let me thank you all for coming this evening. Thank our panelists for a wonderful conversation.